Here's a quick slideshow, just pointing out some of the details of the geography and topography of Rome and Italy. As I mentioned in the unit itself, we did the same thing with the beginning of our look at Greece, and we saw that the location of Greece and just the way that the land is formed, the topography, that these were huge factors in Greece's historical development. And we're going to see pretty much the same thing with Rome and Italy. A lot of the features of the terrain and the locations of some of the sites are important factors in kind of why Rome develops as it does. There's a picture right here of the Dolomites. That's one of the mountain ranges in the north of Italy. Just absolutely beautiful. Italy is a stunning country. I highly recommend you get there if you haven't been. And what's really remarkable about Italy, it's much, much smaller, of course, than Canada. And of course, it kind of partakes of both Europe and, say, more southern regions, almost like Africa. So if you're up north in kind of Turin, Milan, those modern cities, it's very much very European in terms of, well, you can see even this picture, right? It looks like the Alps and very northern. And then when you get down to, say, kind of Naples and then further south into Sicily, you can see a lot of it's much drier, more arid, and you can see almost kind of much hotter and so forth, more kind of like almost like Northern Africa because it's so close. Okay. Um, so we take a look at this map here. Now this, I think I used this in the last unit, but this is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest kind of geographical reach. You can see it's about AD 117, and you can see this massive size of it, right? It stretches from basically England, the north of England, um, in Spain in the west. And then when you go to the east, we're kind of up in the Black Sea and even on the boundaries of Saudi Arabia, and then Egypt, right, and modern day Turkey and Asia Minor. Greece we're familiar with, right, and then Italy itself. This area right here is known as it's France, right, but the Romans knew it as Gaul, Gaul. And then North Africa, this is modern day Tunisia, but the city there called Carthage is an important city that will um, address in this unit in some of the mythological foundations of Rome. Now, a lot of the same things that we said of Greece in terms of its location can also apply to Italy. Remember, we saw with Greece that what's important is location, right? So close, it's kind of in the borderline of Europe and Asia. It's also close to a lot of earlier civilizations, the Egyptian, the Mesopotamians. So it's close proximity to all those. And of course, that allowed both economic and cultural exchange. And as we saw, those were huge factors in Greek, excuse me, intellectual, kind of cultural, and economic development. And the same is true of Rome. I mean, it's close to Greece, so there'll be lots of contact with Greece, especially kind of culturally speaking. But then it's close to Spain, Carthage, North Africa, and other places, and even sailing to Egypt. I mean, it's a long ways, but this is a very, very important trade route. Egypt is always one of the most important provinces in the Roman Empire, basically because it's so fertile. Back in the day, this is before some of the dams were built, excuse me, in Egypt. The Nile Valley was one that was extremely fertile because the Nile used to overflow every year and kind of enrich the surrounding land. So this became, in many ways, the breadbasket of Rome. And to feed the large urban population and the poor population in Rome, they had to bring masses of grain in from Egypt, also from the Black Sea area, but also Egypt was probably the most important. So again, location is important for many of the same reasons that we talked about with Greece. Now I want to move to the peninsula of Italy and then to the city of Rome itself. Now, of course, general features here. You're familiar with the kind of boot of Italy, if you will. This is Sicily, the island that you should know that. Up this area, right, that is modern day France and what the Romans called Gaul. Okay. Now let me begin here by taking a look at the mountain ranges. Two main mountain ranges I want you to pay attention to. The first is the Alps, the kind of largest mountain range in Europe, kind of blocks off, in a sense, Italy from Europe, but a very important feature. And then what we have right up the center of Italy, from the top to the bottom, a mountain range known as the Apennines. And for those of you that perhaps haven't been to Italy, no matter where you travel, if you're in Rome, if you're in Florence, if you're down south, you can always kind of see mountains in the background. It's a very mountainous country. It's kind of surprising when you get there, but you're always going to see it's pretty rugged terrain. Okay, so you can see you have the Alps and the Apennines that kind of go right down the middle of the country. Now, what that's significant is that kind of divides the country into mountainous areas and then more low-lying, kind of plain areas. So, as a result of the Apennines going here, we have one flatland region called the Po Valley, which is named after the Po River. So you can see this is a topographical map. So you can see these elevated areas. This is elevated, but that green, that's more low-lying. Okay, so that's one of them. Then you can see on the heel, that's an area known as Apulia. You can see it's pretty flat too. And on the, excuse me, on the west coast, you have these three main areas. The most important is perhaps, they're all important, but the most important is probably Latium, all right? Because it's in Latium that Rome is located. This arrow basically points to the location of Rome, right? Kind of in the middle of the peninsula, just a couple miles inland from the sea. So Latium is the area that's kind of surrounding the geographical region around Rome. It's still called that, but in Italian it's Lazio today. To the north of Latium, you had an area known as Etruria. Now today, when you get to the area north of Rome, we call it Tuscany, right? Up to places like Florence. And this is, of course, where we're going to encounter in this unit the Etruscans who live in Etruria. So the names is obviously connections to name it. So that's that area there. And then Campania, that's the area to the south. It kind of surrounds modern-day Naples, right? So you can see with the Apennines, right, this big area here. But here too, Etruria, Latium, and Campania, these are pretty low-lying areas. So if you want to travel within Italy, you're basically going to go down this way. Because this going, of course, the mountains, that's just too tough. You want to take the flattest, easiest route if you're going to be moving up and down. Okay. Now this is important when we think of Roman history. The Gauls, remember, who live here, had a tendency to be at times a little bit nomadic, right? That means they could move to other areas surrounding them in search of, say, plunder, of opportunities, food, riches, whatever. They often make incursions into Italy. There's a very famous one that we're going to deal with in 490 that changed the course of Roman history. But basically what I'm getting at here is when people would invade Italy, especially this early history, the Gauls, they of course wouldn't walk through the mountains, right? They would walk the easiest way. So they just walk up and down this, march up and down here, because that was the easiest way, right? Now, as a result of Rome's location in this flat area in the center of the peninsula of Italy, they would often be right in the pathway of these incursions, okay? So why that's important is that Rome from a very early period, because of its position, it was pretty vulnerable. So it had to be able to negotiate or even defend itself against these people that would be moving up. So from a very early period in Roman history, negotiation, diplomacy, and so forth were so important because it was in a very vulnerable position. By the same count, however, it also strategically very advantageous because Rome had access to those different areas. It was kind of centrally located. So once it kind of secured itself in its boundaries, that's how it kind of gives Rome this opportunity to expand in each direction. All right. So as to say, the location of Rome within Latium is kind of a pro and a con. It left them vulnerable, all right, because kind of open territory, but at the same time, it was an advantage as well. The only other things I think in this slide to take note of, beside the mountain ranges, the different geographical regions, are the bodies of water. Right? Of course, you have the Po River, but then you have the Adriatic and then the Mediterranean. There are names of the smaller seas in some of these areas, but they're not terribly important for our purposes. Right? There's the Tyrrhenian Sea and stuff like that. But I do ask that you remember the Adriatic. That is the sea between Italy and Greece, because it's a body of water and a name that'll come up because of the close relationship between these two countries. Just a lot of events take place here, so the Adriatic will come up again in the future. Okay, so get to know, excuse me, these different bodies of water, the different regions and the different mountain ranges, because, I mean, they're basic, but they will come up again and again. So that should help you, give you some grounding, in a sense, in Italian geography and terrain. Now I just want to take a little bit of a closer look at the city of Rome itself. just some really brief things because they do come up. We're going to be taking a look at the city of Rome itself and how it's constructed in a lot of the buildings. So we'll over the course of the term look in great detail at the layout of the city of Rome. But even at this stage, I think it's important to draw your attention to a couple of things because they come up in some of the foundation myths that we're going to explore about the Romans. Okay, so sorry. So remember, I always want to take a look at the city of Rome here. So remember, it's kind of located halfway down the peninsula and just a couple miles inland. Okay. Now here's a kind of, it looks like a bit of a mess to you, no doubt, but there's a couple of things I want to draw your attention to here. First of all, if you take a look at this, I think the most important thing here is the Tiber River. All right. Rome is situated on the banks of the Tiber, and that's this, this river that flows right here, and it flows this way, okay, towards the sea. Now, the mass of the ancient city of Rome is located in this area. So if you just quickly, these are things that we'll take a look at. So here's the Colosseum right there. You're familiar with that. The Roman Forum is right here. This is the modern-day Piazza Navona. The modern-day Vatican is right here. But the first thing I want you to just pay attention to is the river, right? It's on the banks of the Tiber, and that'll become important. When we take a look at kind of remove all those kind of details and just look at the kind of outline of it here. I'm sure you've probably heard of the Seven Hills of Rome, right? Just in the area in which Rome is built, there's a number of hills. And when you're walking around the city today, they're actually pretty tough to kind of recognize just simply because it's kind of so built up and they're not that high or anything like that, okay? But you can see, here's the Tiber coming through here, and you can see that's where the modern-day Vatican is. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to are these two central hills right here, the Capitoline and the Palatine. This is, both in antiquity and today, really the heart of Rome, just in this one area right here. Why these are important is that the Palatine Hill will become the home of emperors, but we're also going to see it early on in some of the foundation myths of Rome. Romulus, who's the kind of founder of Rome, was thought to live in this hut on the Palatine Hill, okay? And then the Capitoline is, will become kind of a very important religious site, important temple of Jupiter's located there. And today that's the kind of the city of Rome. It's called the Campidoglio. It's kind of the political center of Rome. So those are two hills that are very, very important. The rest I'm not too concerned about, but these are important not only for look at what's located, say, on them, but they're just going to help to situate you when you're trying to understand the city. And basically right between them is the Roman Forum, which is the kind of political center of Rome. Okay, so think of this. Think of the Tiber River coming through Rome, the Palatine Hill, the kind of original kind of home of the early founders of Rome, eventually become kind of home to rich Romans. The Capitoline, important kind of religious and political center, and the Forum in between them. The only other one I want to draw your attention to here, because this will come up again and again, this is called the Field of Mars, or the Campus Martius. Campus, just the Latin word for field, and Martius, that's just the adjectival form of Mars. Originally, this was a flat, open area. In fact, what it was basically mostly used for was for practicing military maneuvers, marching, and so on. That's why it's called the Field of Mars, right? Because Mars is the god of war. So originally, the very beginning of Roman history, you have to think of the urban center of Rome really started right here and then started expanding outwards. And what happens is that this flat field, which is usually very open, eventually just becomes more and more built up. So many things that we're going to see, especially in the first centuries BC and AD. A lot of the building that we'll see, like the Piazza Navona and the Pantheon, I think they're located in this area. Okay, so the reason I include it now is that even in the foundation myths, it's going to come up a couple times. Okay, so just be aware. As I say, this is the site of Rome, the Tiber River, the Capitoline, the Palatine, and the Field of Mars, and you got a good basic understanding of the city. So hopefully that this kind of really brief review of the kind of area of the Mediterranean around Italy, the different parts of Italy and the mountain ranges, excuse me, and then just a quick look at some elements of the city of Rome itself. I think this is enough to give you a really kind of firm grasp for the beginnings of Roman history. Okay, as we start to look in, as Rome as a city starts to expand, and I take a look at architecture and the building of things such as the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus, which is the main horse track in Rome, which seated like 250,000 people, and other things, then I'll draw your attention and add more details at that point. But for now, this is more than enough for the first few units. Okay, thank you.